All right, this is the lecture for Lab 5, covering bone histology and the axial skeleton. So here is a long bone. A long bone has been partially dissected. The long bone's broken up into proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. The epiphyses, as you see, have the smooth rounded areas for forming joints. And then the shaft is referred to as the diaphysis. So proximal epiphysis, diaphysis, distal epiphysis. Um, you can see that the outside of the bone is made up of compact bone tissue. So all the way around the outside, you find compact bone tissue. And then you find spongy bone tissue in the epiphyses. Spongy bone tissue looking kind of spongy. There's a sheet of connective tissue on the outside of the bone called the periosteum. So all around the outside of the bone, you find periosteum except the smooth rounded areas. And then lining the inside of the bone and all those nooks and crannies is the endosteum. At the smooth ends where joints are formed, you find the articular cartilage. And then within the epiphyses, besides spongy bone and the little spaces that have the red bone marrow, you have these little lines referred to as epiphyseal lines in adults. So adults have epiphyseal lines, and in children they're referred to as epiphyseal plates. Function of the red bone marrow is to make the blood cells. Here we also see yellow bone marrow found in the medullary cavity of the diaphysis. So medullary cavity, yellow bone marrow in the diaphysis. And yellow bone marrow is where we store lipids, fats, so it's energy storage. And this is a wedge of bone from the diaphysis, so we can see up close. This is all compact bone on the outside, some spongy bone on the inside. The little girders that stretch out forming the spongy bone are called trabeculae. Within the compact bone, we have these reoccurring structure called the osteon. The osteon looks kind of like a dartboard or rings of a tree. The very center of the osteon is a space called the central canal. Within the central canal, we have blood vessels and nerves running through the bone. It turns out each layer of the osteon, or each one of those rings forming the osteon, they are known as the lamella for one, lamellae for multiple ones. So lots of lamellae form the rings of the osteon around the central canal. Here is a model of the osteon. So this whole thing is the osteon. There's the central canal. There's the lamella, one layer, one ring is lamella. There's these little pockets. These little pockets we see scattered throughout are called lacuna for one, lacunae for many. And that is where the osteocytes, the bone cells, stay. And then we also see these faint little lines going toward the central canal. These little lines are called canaliculus for one, or canaliculi for many. And again, within the lacuna are the osteocytes. And on this model, the osteocytes look like angry little eyes. All right, cartilage. The articular cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage. In cartilage, as we know, we have the matrix. Then we have these little pockets. Again, they are called lacuna. And then the cells in cartilage are chondrocytes. So cartilage cells, chondrocytes in the lacuna of the hyaline cartilage. All right, moving on to the axial skeleton. Then we have the skull. The skull has 22 bones. Who knew, right? It includes the occipital bone on the posterior end of the skull, the parietal bones right and left on the superior part of the skull, the frontal bone toward the anterior side, and laterally we have the right and left temporal bones. There's also a sphenoid bone. Here we can see a portion of it. This is the mandible or lower jaw bone. We have a right and left maxilla or maxillary bones. The cheekbones are the zygomatic bones, right and left. We have the lacrimal bones, then the eye socket, the nasal bones. We also have sutures. Again, sutures are fibrous joints that are immobile, and when they're between bones in the skull, that's why they're called sutures. So the ones we have to remember is the lambdoid suture between the occipital bone and the parietal bones, the sagittal suture between the right and left parietal bones, the coronal suture between the frontal bone and parietal bones, and the squamous suture between the temporal bone and the parietal bone. And there's a right and left squamous suture. All right, here is the temporal bone. We have to remember some of its special structures. This includes this opening here. This opening is called the external acoustic meatus. You probably know it as the ear canal. There is the external acoustic meatus. Below that is this rough patch called the mastoid process. And then anterior to that, toward the front, is this thin piece of bone called the styloid process. Then we have this little curved divot in the temporal bone. That divot's called the mandibular fossa. The mandible, as you see, fits into the mandibular fossa. And then this piece of bone sticking out here is the zygomatic process. Here's the mandible. The mandible has this portion called the mandibular condyle. So the mandibular condyle of the mandible fits into the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone to give us the moving joints that let us open and close our jaw. Here's an anterior view of the skull. Here we can see the portions of the ethmoid bone in the orbits or eye sockets. We can also see parts of the ethmoid bone within the nasal cavity. Also in the nasal cavity are these two small bones on the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. These are the inferior nasal concha. And then this one thin little bone in the middle is the vomer. So the vomer and the ethmoid bone help to form this wall, this nasal septum, in the middle of the nasal cavity that breaks it up into a right side and a left side. The ethmoid bone has what's called the perpendicular plate. So this is the perpendicular plate. Here's the vomer. So perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone and vomer form the bony portion of that nasal septum. Here is a view of the skull. We've cut off the top of the skull and looking down into the skull. So this is inside the skull. Here's the frontal bone in orange. Right here is part of the ethmoid bone. The little point sticking up, sort of like a shark fin, that is called the crista galli. And then the bone tissue around the crista galli with all these little holes, that is called the cribriform plate. So cribriform plate surrounds the shark fin, the crista galli. And those little holes are actually olfactory foramina, the little holes that let the nose's smell nerves pass through the skull to the brain. All right, there is the inferior view of the skull if you remove the mandible. So here is the upper teeth, and this is the maxilla, and then this blue bone here and here, there's two of them, are the pontine bones. So the right and left pontine bones. So the pontine bone and the maxilla bones help to form the hard palate of the oral cavity. The maxilla or maxillary bones have this portion that makes contact, makes joints with the pontine bones, and those are called the pontine process. The pontine process of the maxillary bone makes contact with the pontine bone. Together, these pieces make up the hard palate. Here is the occipital bone. This large hole here is the foramen magnum. The spinal cord passes through the foramen magnum. Then we also have these two smooth rounded knobs. These smooth rounded knobs called the occipital condyles. Occipital condyles form joints with the first vertebra of the vertebral column. That is the joint that helps us say nod our head yes. All right, again, looking into the skull after cutting the top off, this portion here is the sphenoid bone. And the sphenoid bone has this little depression here called the sella turcica. Temporal bone, occipital bone. Here is a mid-sagittal section of the skull. Here is the frontal bone. You can see there's a space within the frontal bone called the frontal sinus. There's also a space in the sphenoid bone called the sphenoidal sinus. Ethmoid bone, ethmoidal sinus. Maxillary bones have their own sinuses. Moving on to the hyoid bone. Hyoid bone is a U-shaped bone found in our throat. It connects to the larynx, and it is the only bone that does not form a joint, does not articulate with other bones. All right, here is a vertebra. A vertebra has a number of structures that are found in pretty much all the vertebra. We have the body, the large portion of bone here. We have the vertebral foramen, the hole where the spinal cord passes through. Then we have processes sticking off of it. We have the spinous process sticking out posteriorly, the transverse processes right and left sticking out laterally. Sticking up superiorly are the superior articular processes, and then we can't see them, but sticking down are the inferior articulating processes. Superior articulating processes make joints with the vertebra above. Inferior articulating processes make joints with the vertebra below. Here is the vertebral column. Vertebral column has 7 cervical vertebrae in the neck region, 12 thoracic vertebrae in the thoracic region, 5 lumbar vertebrae in the lumbar or lower back region, the sacrum and the coccyx. So the sacrum and the coccyx are also part of the vertebral column. And you can remember the numbers by thinking about breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So breakfast at 7 cervical vertebrae, lunch at noon, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and dinner is at 5, nice and early, 5 lumbar vertebrae. Oh yeah, sacrum and coccyx. Between the vertebra, you actually see holes on the sides where spinal nerves come out. Those holes are called intervertebral foramina. We also, of course, have the intervertebral discs between the bodies of adjacent vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae are the smallest of the vertebra. They also have extra holes, extra foramen. So they have transverse foramen in the transverse processes. So every cervical vertebra has these extra holes. The first vertebra is called the atlas. Here is the atlas. You can see it looks almost just like a ring. It has no spinous process, no actual body. It forms the articulates or articulates with the occipital condyles, so the skull rests on top of the atlas, and then has a little smooth area that forms a joint with the axis. The axis is the second cervical vertebra. It has this piece of bone sticking up superiorly. It's called the dens. So the dens sticks up, forms a joint with the atlas, allowing the atlas to pivot around the dens, allowing us to turn our head in the no motion. The thoracic vertebra have extra little facets on the transverse processes and on the body. These extra facets are there because the thoracic vertebra always form joints, form articulations with the ribs. So the extra facets are where those joints with the ribs form. The lumbar vertebra are the biggest vertebra and have no extra pieces to them. All right, here is the sacrum, large triangular bone, and the coccyx. The sacrum and the coccyx are fused vertebrae, forming the end of the vertebral column. Moving on to thoracic cage. Thoracic cage forms the bulk of the thoracic cavity. It includes anteriorly the sternum. Here's this flat bone, the sternum. The sternum has 3 pieces, the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. And then, of course, we have 12 pairs of ribs, 12 ribs on each side. Ribs 1 through 7 are true ribs because their costal cartilage attaches directly to the sternum. And then ribs 8 through 12 are false ribs because either their costal cartilage attaches to the costal cartilage of rib 7 or they don't attach at all. Rib 11 and 12 do not attach at all. And then rib 11 and 12 are also known as floating ribs because, again, they do not attach at all to the sternum. So 7 true ribs, 5 false ribs, and 2 floating ribs on each side of the thoracic cage. Here is the view of a rib coming in and making contact, forming a joint with thoracic vertebra. So you can see forming a joint with the transverse process of the vertebra and also with the body of the vertebra. And then this rib will also make contact with the body of the vertebra above this one. So you have 2 vertebrae making 3 contacts with the rib. And that is it for this lesson.